Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's event hosted by the Warsaw Institute EU Climate Policy in Focus. Hereby, I extend my warm welcome to my today's distinguished guests, Mr. Peter Klepp from the Brussels Report, where he's a editor-in-chief. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you.
And Mr. Matthias Kohan, foreign policy writer for Mandiner. Welcome.
Hello, great to see you all. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, gentlemen, for joining. Good to have you on board. I think we can begin with the topic of today's discussion. So, as we are aware, in recent years, we've been observing rapid changes in European Union climate policy. Therefore, the first topic I want to touch here with you is what are the biggest challenges in your opinion, and what will be the challenges in future for all of the member states that will face the changes in terms of EU climate policy. So we'll start with Peter Klepp. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. So, what are the biggest challenges? I think, first of all, dealing with everything that has been decided, the many, frankly, unrealistic targets and policies that have been agreed at the European Union level. We can think of the idea to phase out non-electrical vehicles. I mean, the basically de facto ban on the combustion engine. If you listen to, for example, what the CEO of Toyota has said, that he does not expect the percentage of electric vehicles to go above 30%. I mean, he should know a thing or two about this, right? He's the CEO of Toyota. Nevertheless, the European politicians claim to know better, and they say, no, we need to phase out these type of vehicles that are basically deemed unacceptable. Now, I think it's very difficult for anybody, even for industry insiders, to predict how a market will evolve. Perhaps electrical vehicles will, prove to be superior. But I don't think politicians and policymakers should pick one technology over the other. And that is what the European Union is doing. It's not only dictating that there should be less CO2. It is also trying to micromanage how EU member states are getting there by picking certain vehicles over others, by declaring certain energy sources to be superior over others. It declares certain energy sources renewable, for example, wind power, solar power, hydro. You can say that these are indeed renewable energy sources, but then also something like biomass, which basically involves shipping wood from across the world to Europe and burning it over here. Now, I'm not against that, but the question is this renewable? Is this so much better than other supposedly environmentally unfriendly energy sources? And then, of course, we have nuclear power, which the European Commission is supposed to promote according to the Euratom Treaty. But it is very wary to do that. It's very much basically held hostage ideologically by some left-green ideology, by taxpayer-funded left-green NGOs that come up with all kinds of, in my view, irrational arguments against nuclear power. And despite the fact that you have France, which is a very powerful member state, lobbying for nuclear power, still, the European bureaucracy, of course, in cahoots with Germany, are resisting very, very firmly. They're losing the debate. I think they have already lost public opinion. Public opinion is looking at reality, how fantastic nuclear power is. And again, we should not subsidize nuclear power, of course. We should not give it any priority. It just should be given a fair chance. And that is exactly what the European Commission is resisting. That's why I think, first of all, the big challenge will be to deal with this. Ideally, in my view, abolish a lot of it. The second challenge will be for those wanting more sanity in the climate and energy debate, is to try to stop new initiatives that continue on the same route of central planning, micromanaging, and similar approaches.
Thank you for your response, especially for touching the topic of electric vehicles and biomass. Same question to Matthias Kohan. Biggest challenges, current challenges, and future challenges. And additionally, I would like to ask you for a short, let's say, statement or opinion whether this ongoing transformation is a brake or accelerator to European economies. Is it slowing them down or speeding them up? The floor is yours.
Well, my headline in this case would be that climate policy makes the European Union and European member states pick their battles. Like building on what Peter has just said, the 2035 deadline for the phasing out of internal combustion engine vehicles, that is at the same time a Kickstarter for the European electric vehicle industry. It is something that accelerates our catching up, in this case, to China, which is already basically the world leader in terms of electric vehicle design. It is something that would create new jobs in Europe, but it's also something that destroys the economy of many regions and many countries. Many of them lie in Central Europe, in the Visegrad region, or in Germany, that have relied on automotive manufacturing and manufacturing internal combustion engines in the last couple of decades. That's one thing. And what it also does is it presents a geopolitical challenge to the European Union. You can either have a phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles, or you can have de-risking from China. You can't have both at the same time. It's just not possible, because at this time, the smaller issue is who designs and who produces the electric vehicles themselves. But there is also an issue with control over the strategic materials, the rare earths that are needed to produce batteries and other components of electric vehicles that are under the control of China increasingly. So it makes one decision in the area of climate policy, makes other decisions in geopolitical terms or in foreign policy much harder to make. That's one thing. And there are also issues that are knocking on our door and that are actually protesting on the streets of Europe right now as we speak. The farmers' protests in France, in Germany, and beforehand in the Netherlands, which has also led to the second main surprise in the November Dutch elections, that is the farmers' protests. There is something in European agriculture that has been awakened that is actually a very strong reaction to years worth of European policies that have impacted the European basis of the European economy, the basis of European food security, very negatively. So there might also be an issue and a breaking point at which Europe would have to choose between its ecological and environmental standards and affordable food. That's also an issue. The nature restoration law, as we know it right now, according to many estimates, which was passed last year by the European Parliament, will make land accessible for the European agriculture, and that impacts Dutch farmers, that impacts Polish farmers, that impacts French farmers. It will make that size of land less. It will make less land available for agricultural production and food production, which will drive food prices up in Europe. So I would basically just argue that everything is a trade-off. The European climate policy is a trade-off as well. With the whole phase-out thing, with the deadline to 2035, we are both accelerating the European economy and wrecking another part of it and making geopolitical decisions more challenging to make. With the nature restoration law and other laws on farming, we are both cleaning our agriculture, making our food processing pipeline more safe and more ecological, but also we are wrecking some elements of the European agricultural base. And there's also the carbon trading system that we all live under, and the carbon emission norms that are already in force for automotives around the European Union. That has made industrial production and driving cars, frankly, very, very expensive in Europe. This has a very negative growth effect. So we will have to face a couple of dilemmas that are going to be politically challenging between de-risking and decarbonizing. de-risking from China and decarbonizing our fleet that we drive with. We are going to have to face a challenge of choosing between decarbonizing, carbon trading, and growth, economic growth, frankly. And we are going to have to choose between ecologically sustainable food and cheap food. And those are all going to be politically very sensitive debates to carry. And although the green orthodoxy seems currently to have the backing of the European mainstream, it's not going to work without the voters. And if the voters face these very dilemmas, I'm not sure they are going to lean the way the European elite and the current European mainstream wants it to.
Thank you very much. As you've mentioned, the role of China in current world order is really, really important and interesting. So I think this is a good topic for another debate as well. I will just come back for a second to Peter Klepp, asking about brake or accelerator. Short statement from your side, and let us know what's your opinion on that.
On what exactly? Brake or accelerator? Brake or accelerator? In what sense?
Whether the EU climate policy is slowing the economies or speeding them up. I'm thinking of economies of European Union member states.
Well, it's damaging European economies. You know, there's a European climate tax. It's called the it's the European Emission Trading System, which basically imposes certain costs on in industry. And you know, European policymakers have decided last year that this is very unfair as compared to, you know, the rest of the world. So European industry now has to compete with the rest of the world, which does not have. So after shooting themselves in the foot, European policymakers have said, now we have to levy import taxes on supposedly climate damaging imports from the rest of the world. And it has done that by means of the so-called CBAM, which is the climate tariff. So in a nutshell, yes, the EU is, with its climate policies, hurting innovation. With its central planning, it is damaging the economic growth that we actually need to, you know, generate innovation that will ultimately be the only way to come up with environmentally sustainable solutions. And you should know there's another approach, an approach to, you know, deal with climate change in a free market manner. It has been worked out through a group of academics that have you know, come up with an alternative to the Paris Climate Accord. And their idea is basically that countries that would sign such a treaty would not pledge to impose taxes and central planning and control and regulations and tariffs. No, it would basically you know, reward the signatories with lower tariffs, with more free trade, provided that they would conduct you know, free market policies that ultimately generate innovation. For example, you know, policies that would incentivize privatization, policies that you know would have targeted tax cuts for environmentally friendly sectors. It's always a bit tricky to do that, but you could try to do it in a technologically neutral manner. Also, policies that would sort of reward investing in bonds more attractive, provided it's again environmentally friendly. This is called co-victory bonds in the jargon. So this kind of approach would not be about central planning. It would not be the punitive approach. It would be sort of, you know, rewarding investment, generating, promoting investment and innovation. And ultimately, this is the best that we can do for the environment. But that's not the approach that's currently chosen by European policymakers, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. We spoke about the challenges, we spoke about the role of economies, and now I want to ask you, gentlemen, about the effectiveness with which EU is addressing the climate challenges. How effective is that, in your opinion? And is reaching the goals by member states a utopia, or will it technically happen in future? Are member states capable of reaching all of the goals given to them by the European Union policymakers? We'll start with Maciej Kuchan.
Right. Well, nobody, I think, in their right minds currently thinks that the European Union as a whole, or most countries thereof, would be on track to meeting their commitments made on the Paris Climate Conference, or that the 2050 net zero project would be on track. So in that sense, of course, on the most macro of the macro levels, the European climate policy could not be said to be effective. But on the flip side, if we take another framework of analysis, and if we examine how carbon dioxide emissions in the European Union have evolved, we can actually determine that in the European Union right now, the trend of carbon emissions has been steadily downward. Like the European Union now in 2022 has emitted 2.7 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide. The peak was almost 4 billion metric tons in the year 1979. So there are some levels on which we have made progress. I think the share of electric vehicles within total new car registrations in the European Union, which reached 22% in 2022, is also a sign that in the regions of Europe where electric vehicles are a feasible means of transportation, I would argue this is car sharing. I would argue this is large cities. I would argue this would be shorter distance work routes. This is something that is already happening. And in terms of carbon dioxide emissions, in terms of extended manufacturer responsibility, in terms of waste treatment, the European Union is already a leading actor on the world stage. The issue is that, first, it's not completely sure how much correlation equals causality in this case, because as you see, European carbon dioxide emissions have been on a downward trend since the late 1980s, where the thing we today call European climate policy has not been a thing. That's one thing. And the other thing is, I'm considering that we are close to breaking point at which the European Union will have to make a decision. And that decision is, I think that's something Peter touched on as well, do we allow growth to grind to a halt? There is some reason behind the fact that the European Union currently is the only major economic bloc in the world that has not experienced any GDP growth whatsoever in the year 2023. And that is going to be ultimately both a deliberation between different social groups in the European Union and between geographical areas of the European Union. Because you see, as a Dutch person, as a Belgian, maybe as a Luxembourgian, as an Austrian, you can make a very strong case for degrowth in your country or lack of growth. You can make the argument that the standard of living that you have reached at that point in your country is the most that is feasible ecologically. But there are places in the European Union like Latvia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, or maybe even Poland that would like to still grow. I think the issue is not simply in the indicators that we use to measure our environmental progress. I think we're not on track with those, but we are making progress with those. The issue that we are on currently of diminishing carbon dioxide emissions and every other kind of emission, every other kind of environmental metric that we are making good progress on, whether it is politically feasible to continue that trend into the future as we hit more and more and more breaking points at which European voters who have different manifold preferences within the European Union will at some point start to vote against the European climate policy and will start to treat it as a priority in their voting behavior. So my issue is not whether the indicators currently show that the European climate policy is effective or not. My issue is that the trend we are on is not politically sustainable.
Thank you very much for your insights. And now I will give floor to Peter Kleb. Same question about effectiveness of European Union activity towards climate challenges. And the feasibility of reaching goals by all of the member states?
Well, yeah, to start with, the political sustainability, indeed, we have the farmer protests in France, in Belgium, all across Europe, I would say. And of course, it's complex. It's change. The reasons are a little different in every country, but the common topic is that the farmers are very angry about the European Green Deal, about the fact that they are being, micromanaged even more than in the past. So I don't think this is politically sustainable or economically sustainable. A huge blowback is coming. We've already seen even the EPP, the more centrist force in the European Parliament, becoming much more hostile to EU green policies. So I think this will only continue. And if you look at indeed, decarbonization, reduction of CO2, yes, that's happening. But in the United States, it's happening more quickly. And, this proves that everything depends on innovation. If you have growth, then you have innovation, and then you have more environmentally sustainable solutions, including decarbonization. If you don't have growth, like for example in Germany, which has a risk of deindustrialization. Let's maybe not be hysteric about this, but let's also not let's also not be naive about it. That there's a serious risk. Germany, in the midst of the energy crisis, has decided to continue with its suicidal policy of shutting down nuclear plants, and as a result of it, it has to rely more on coal. It has to rely on what we call brown coal, lignite. It had to shut down a village last year. There were a lot of green protests against it, against the shutting down of the village, but this was directly the consequence of shutting down nuclear power plants, because the village had to be emptied, because there had to be lignite exploitation in order to generate electricity, and that would not have been necessary if Germany had not been shutting down its perfectly functional nuclear power plants. So it's all very ideological. I would say it's not even green. It's some proto-communist mindset with the German Greens at the heart of the evil policies, of course. And I think we should also look at a different approach in Europe from the United Kingdom. If we want to achieve growth, we should not only abandon our central planning model, but we should also open up to the world. And if you look at, for example, how the UK has been acting since Brexit, for example, the reason that it was welcomed into the CPTPP, this is a great new trade framework, a new trade deal that covers 15% of world GDP with countries like Japan, Canada, Chile, but also Malaysia. The key reason why the UK was allowed in is because it did not copy the European Union's deforestation regulations, which are very hostile to the idea that we should trust the standards of our trading partners. Now, if you look at Malaysia, yes, there has been some issues with palm oil and deforestation, but the country has made a lot of progress according to NGOs. And this is being recognized by the United Kingdom. They basically say, look, we want to trade. We don't want to export our regulatory preferences to our trading partners. Now, the EU is choosing a different approach. And as a result of that, trade negotiations between Southeast Asia and the EU have been frozen since June. So it's not just about green regulation, it's also about what I would call green protectionism. Policymakers that try to overload any trade negotiations with all kinds of demands. You have the same problem with Argentina, the Mercosur. They're saying, okay, look, you want a trade deal, or do you want to send us a list with all kinds of regulations that we have to implement in our democracies? No, friends, we want to trade. But the green protectionism is infecting all of that. And ultimately, this will also be bad for the environment, because if you have less trade, you have less growth, you have less innovation, and this will ultimately, not only make us poorer, but also hurt the environment.
Thank you very much, Peter. Now I will just ask you a question that we received from one of our viewers. The question is about national climate pledges of Germany, Austria, Italy, and Croatia, the Paris Agreement. The question is, this group of countries, what do they have in common, and what is the difference in renewable energies in those countries, especially solar and wind? Germany, Austria, Italy, and Croatia. If you have any insight on that topic, the floor is yours. Maybe Matthias.
Right. So last time I checked the Paris pledges, what these countries had in common was that they were not on track to meet their Paris commitments. So that's maybe something that we have to speak to before addressing the individual energetic situations of these countries. Well, I think these countries couldn't be more different, honestly. Like there are some regional similarities between Italy, northern Italy, some parts of Croatia and Austria. Like the applicability, for example, of hydroelectric power is something that connects part of these countries. But I would also say that it's very hard to compare although deindustrializing, as Peter rightly said, but still a core industrial nation of the European Union, Germany, which is already suffering from the consequences of its disastrous nuclear exit policy, Atomausstieg policy, that it instituted under Chancellor Angela Merkel, with, for example, Croatia, which has an economy based mostly around tourism, which I think is something that is significantly easier to fuel by renewable energy sources. Like I would generally say, as a rule of thumb, that the less a country in Europe depends on industry to sustain its GDP, to sustain its standards of living, the more it is possible for that country to decarbonize and to get back on track, or to get more on track towards its various commitments. I think these countries are very, very different in this regard. I would rank Austria as the most likely to be able to meet its Paris commitments, and I would rate perhaps Germany, even though the Greens are currently in power, even though the economy is already suffering from consequences of very intense climate-oriented policy, I would rate Germany as the least likely to meet its Paris commitments. You can see that it's the Greens actually in Germany who have no other choice than to reopen, as Peter said, coal-fired power plants. Like at some point, democratic reality and economic reality meets the Greens as well. And there is only so much leeway that you have in a country that is based around the industry that you can do as the government. Like if the situation is such that even under a green government, coal-fired power plants have to be reopened, which I would like to say is a step back in terms of meeting commitments under the Paris Accords when compared to nuclear energy, then what you can say for that country is that it's not realistic for that country to meet its Paris commitments. So I would say this is a very diverse set of countries, and basically Austria, perhaps Croatia, are more suited to be more on track, but none of them is currently on track.
Thank you very much for that specific response. Now let's move to Peter Klepp. I want to ask you the same question about national climate pledges of Germany, Austria, Italy, and Croatia to the Paris Agreement. What do they have in common, and what is the difference in renewable energies, especially solar and wind?
Well, I think Matthias covered most. Maybe what I would like to say is, yes, it's true that Croatia, for example, is very dependent on tourism, but a lot of the tourists are coming from Northern Europe. So there's actually massive financial transfers from the north to the south. I mean, voluntarily, not only through the EU, but voluntarily through market mechanisms, through tourism. And of course, if Northern Europe would impoverish, well, it is impoverishing as we speak, then this will ultimately also hurt the tourist potential of Southern Europe. So the core of European industry is built on the chemical industry and on cheap energy. It's not possible to have a thriving economy without cheap and abundant energy. And this is one of the reasons why the European Commission has always been in favor, up to a certain point, has always been in favor of nuclear power, to the point that they would even, advantaging it, which is also not right. But now they have changed. They are, in the last 20 years, you could say, they have been captured by some kind of a left-green, top-down control mindset, which believes that unproven, unreliable energy sources like wind and solar power should be the bedrock of our system. I would love that to be the case. I'm not against. I mean, it would be fantastic to be less dependent on the Middle East, for example. But in the real world, those technologies are not reliable or not sufficiently reliable. Certainly not reliable to serve as 100% contributors to our energy grid. So to go back to your question, yeah, there's big differences between all of those countries. Of course, Austria has some hydro power, which is fantastic. Italy has gas reserves that it is unwilling to exploit. Same for Germany. I've been talking a lot about the nuclear power, but let's not forget Germany has potential for shale gas. And shale gas is de facto banned in Europe. I mean, the UK is just as guilty there. The UK is also banning shale gas. Now, when Vladimir Putin shut off the gas supply to Europe, of course, in response to the European sanctions, most of this supply, almost one-on-one, has been replaced by American shale gas. Now, Joe Biden is now trying to play a bit of politics with that because his green base is against shale. But shale has been incredibly important, to make the United States less dependent, less energy dependent on the rest of the world. The problem is that Russian gas was cheap and American LNG shale gas is expensive. Now, I think we should still be incredibly grateful to the United States that they are helping out, us out with admittedly expensive shale gas. But don't you think it's crazy that we pay a lot of that we pay a lot for shale, for imported shale, when we have it here at home in Germany? And, if you think it's a taboo to discuss nuclear power in Germany, well, it's even more of a taboo to discuss shale. And they come up with all kinds of arguments, how terrible it would be for the environment, etc., etc. But at the same time, we are importing it. So it's if it is so bad for the environment, it's incredibly hypocritical then. But also, if you look into the actual debate, it is not always necessarily under the same circumstances so bad for the environment. There's lots of shades of gray in that debate. In the United States, for example, the damage to the environment has, this problem has improved a lot. And you could also sort it with pricing and other, trying to price the externalities. So an outright ban is, of course, the worst approach. And in any case, any energy source, it will always come with, with a cost for the environment. In that context, I also just want to say that we will still need, fossil fuels for the time being. Maybe we will see fantastic technological progress with batteries or with hydrogen. It's very, very doubtful. It's another experiment the European Commission is now undertaking. They're doing all kinds of experiments with our, prosperity being mortgaged. But for the time being, we have fossil fuels that we have to rely on. That's the reality for the next 10, 20 years. So then I would say it's probably better to, have the fossil fuels being exploited here in Europe in more or less environmentally acceptable conditions, rather than importing them from dictatorships halfway across the world. And also there, and there I'll conclude, we have to look at the Netherlands. The Netherlands, which last year, believe it or not, in the middle of an energy crisis, decided to continue with its plan to shut down the Groningen gas field, which is one of the biggest gas fields in the world. So today, European industry is still suffering from very high energy prices. They have to compete with the United States, with China, where the energy prices are cheaper. What are policymakers doing? On the basis of very shady arguments. In the case of Groningen, they claim that there's a higher risk for earthquakes, which, if you listen to experts, that's not as clear-cut at all. And they simply continue, with basically populist experiments at the expense of our future well-being.
Thank you very much, especially for elaborating on shale gas and fossil fuels. And staying in a topic of fossil fuels, last question to you, gentlemen, more of a geopolitically oriented. Do you see the possibility of a return to the import of fossil fuels from Russia in case of the end of war in Ukraine? Here I'm speaking about the, let's say, comparable scope in numbers to the deliveries that took place before 2022. We'll start with Matthias Kolan.
Right. So before we can talk about whether it's going to return to the EU fossil fuel market, whether Russia is going to be a significant energy exporter to Europe in the future after the war of aggression of Vladimir Putin on Ukraine, we first have to acknowledge that the decoupling from Russia has not completely happened, and it's not likely to completely happen even during this war. Like, there are, of course, countries that have openly said that they are either unwilling or unable to decouple partly or fully from Russian energy sources. Hungary and Slovakia and Austria still have long-term gas contracts with Russia's Gazprom. Eastern Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, Austria, and partly Czechia are still getting crude oil from Russia. And what's a new element, and it's also pretty surprising, is that Russian LNG, Russian liquefied natural gas, is increasingly a part of the European energy mix. Like, countries you would surprise to find in this camp, countries like Belgium or Spain, have actually drastically increased their Russian LNG imports over the last year. So Russian energy sources are still very much part of the European energy supply system, even though it's not to the extent that it used to be before the war, of course. And of course, it's going to be a politically delicate issue for many European member states, perhaps most European member states, to even discuss the recovery of Russian fossil fuels to the EU market after the end of the war. And I would probably assume that countries where this is a highly politicized issue, like Poland, like the Baltic states, like some Scandinavian countries, are not going to be interested in introducing Russian energy sources back to their markets. But there are solutions that we see happening. For example, in the case of Germany, Germany has already very much increased their dependency, for example, on KEPCO, on Kazakh export blend crude oil from the Central Asian Republic of Kazakhstan. The great qualities of KEPCO are, for example, that it's very much like Russian Urals oil. If you use KEPCO, you're not going to have to set up your refineries made for Russian oil to suit KEPCO. But it also comes through the same pipelines that Russian gas or Russian oil used to come from. And there is no guarantee whatsoever, the two blends of oil being so closely related, that the oil you are buying that is labeled as Kazakh oil is in fact not Russian oil. The same applies, for example, to diesel we might import from Turkey, China, or India after the European Union banned diesel imports from Russia altogether. This might very well be, even though it's labeled Turkish, Chinese, or Indian diesel, this might very well be diesel made of Russian crude oil. So Russian fossil fuel sources are still very much present on the European market. And what I would say in this context, looking to the future, is it is very much understandable that some member states, perhaps many member states, are not interested in importing Russian fossils. But the key element I would bring into the room here is that if only a part of the European Union's member states will return, for example, to importing gas from the Russian Federation, that benefits even those member states that are not themselves importing gas from the Russian Federation. Let me explain, because this might seem like a confusing argument at first. So it's not as simple that LNG imported from the United States is expensive and pipeline gas from the Russian Federation is cheap. It's not that simple. There is a market-determined price of gas in the European Union that is being determined on a Dutch stock exchange. And the amount of gas on that stock exchange and the access of that stock exchange to gas sources determines the benchmark gas prices that then regulate the basis for any contracts in Europe, whether it be LNG or Russian gas. So if there is gas that is more plentiful on the European market in general, if some countries that are still interested in importing Russian gas after the war, if that is the case, if Russian gas is still present at that stock exchange, that brings down the cost of gas for everyone. So I think in the interest of Europe's future, and in the interest of Europe's competitiveness, I think for the countries that see no direct geopolitical threat from keeping Russian gas and Russian oil, although of course not exclusively, within their energy mix, I think we should consider that something that is also a contribution to the European Union's overall competitiveness. Because again, the more the amount of suppliers we have for gas and crude oil is limited, the higher the values of stock exchange prices climb on the European stock exchange. So in a limited framework, of course, and with maximum sensitivity to political delicacies in many member states. But I think that the massive gas station and oil field next to the European Union will have to benefit the European Union in some way, because there is no other path to competitiveness of the European industry and of the European transport system without in some way harnessing the power of that great resource next door, which is currently very much justifiedly embroiled in this political discussion. Of course, it is a geopolitical consideration whether we want to spend European money on bolstering the war chest of an aggressor that is encroaching on the borders of a country that neighbors the European Union. Of course, this is a very important geopolitical consideration. But I think that after the war, it is very much going to be a discussion that will include elements of Europe's competitiveness, and that will end in a decision of some member states to return to trade to Russia and some member states to shut off trade with Russia altogether. And I think this is an acceptable framework for European competitiveness.
Thank you very much for this really, really interesting and broad forecast about the future of Russian fossil fuels in European Union. And then we'll finish this panel off with opinion of Peter Klebs on that topic. So possibility of a return of Russian fossil fuels to European Union after the end of war. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you. And Matthias indeed mentioned that we have seen a continuation of gas flows from Russia to indeed, like, for example, the Belgian port of Zeebrugge, which has welcomed a lot of Russian LNG gas. And then, of course, you have all the, the circumvention of the sanctions through India, through, Central Asia, through the stance. So at the end of the day, if you look at the history of sanctions, they rarely work very well. Yes, they work to impoverish the country. Yeah, if we want to make Russia poorer, that's possible with sanctions. If you want sanctions to be used to stop Russia from, attacking its neighbors, unfortunately, sanctions do not appear to be very successful with that. Once again, the weapon deliveries to Ukraine have been successful to a degree, even if lately, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, we see that's no longer the case, also because there hasn't been so many weapon deliveries, of course. So long story short, trade has continued to a degree, commodities trade between Russia and the West in shady ways. So I think we have to distinguish between two scenarios. The first scenario is that we go to some kind of a new Cold War. And this would mean that you have some kind of a Russian-Chinese bloc that have all kinds of commodities that, are traded amongst each other, but that we would have a hard time or a harder time accessing. The second scenario would be that we would return to what was more or less the status before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think in both scenarios the answer should be the same. I think in both scenarios we have to abandon our deliberate discrimination of domestic fossil fuel production, because the fact that Germany, for example, was so dependent on Russia is not an outcome of market forces. In itself, Germany was always, of course, going to get a degree of its commodities from Russia. But as I mentioned, if you phase out nuclear power plants, if you have a de facto ban on on shale, if you're neighboring the Netherlands and in Italy, domestic gas exploration, also in the UK, is severely constrained. If you have a whole lot of European countries that have shut down the nuclear power plants, like Sweden and Italy, or are planning to do so, like Belgium, or even France at one point, imagine, then you have a, let's say, an incredibly hostile policy environment for domestic energy production. So, of course, we should welcome energy sources from outside of Europe, but clearly we should not be, suffocating our own domestic energy production. So whether we go to some kind of Cold War 2.0 or whether we go back to normal, the answer is the same. We have to stop suffocating our own energy production. We have to stop with these policies of economic suicide, and then we probably still will, I think, even in a Cold War 2.0 scenario, like import a bit of commodities from Russia and other shady countries. But the point is not that it's a massive problem that we import a bit of and that we have a bit of trade with them. The point is that we should not be geostrategically dependent from these kind of hostile actors. And at the end of the day, this is something that is ultimately entirely in our own hands. And let's hope that the next European Parliament election will provide some kind of a wake-up call for the left-green dominant thinking, that yes, we will go back to or post-World War II instincts of realizing how important domestic energy production really is.
Thank you very much, precisely for introducing the topic of the new scenario of Cold War. Gentlemen, I would like to thank you so much for this debate and interesting insights given by you to our institute and our viewers. I wish you and our followers a really nice evening and the rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.